North Korea, or as some call it Best Korea, not only is the butt of many a joke, but it's also a nuclear-armed country controlling one of the largest militaries in the world with experience in 21st century warfare and more artillery pieces per capita than blue-haired baristas in Seattle. A significant amount of time is spent deterring our friend Kim from taking his military south into the Republic of Korea, and a large portion of that effort are the 32,000 American troops in the south at any given time. So what happens if they do start marching down? What's the plan there? Well, it turns out the answer is attacking first and assassinating the supreme leader. Reunification, the like and subscribe button, and let's talk about it. Now, this is usually the part of the video where I'm supposed to give a 20-minute background on the Korean Peninsula and all the events starting from the most recent ice age up until today that led us to where we are now. But I'm going to assume my audience did not grow up Amish and or in actual North Korea and have a rough understanding of how we ended up with this map. Before we talk about if Kim Jong-un actually poops or not, I first want to talk about our friends over at the USCCA, a national gun owners organization with over 860,000 members. This is your one-stop shop for courses, classes, and access to legal support as it relates to the world of arming yourself to protect you and your family. By joining, you'll gain access to the Protector Academy, a secure online platform packed with reading material, video lessons, digital books, and more, along with an included subscription to Concealed Carry magazine. Most importantly, you'll gain access to their network of legal representation and self-defense liability insurance. Even when you are forced into a self-defense situation and did everything right, it's still going to cost you your time, money, and could still potentially land you in jail. With the USCCA's trusted legal reps, you can carry knowing that you're not just physically protected, but legally too. If you want to support the channel, make sure to sign up today using the link you see on the screen, and you'll see what unique training opportunities are open for you. Thank you again to the USCCA, and now back to the video. There will never be a day where we get an accurate number of North Korean troop counts. However, most estimates assume roughly 1.3 million on active duty, another 600,000 in reserve, along with over 4,000 tanks, 100 naval vessels, and roughly 500 aircraft. However, in the event of a full mobilization, the number of fighters they could bring to the table pushes well into the several millions. Unlike countries like the United States that have to be ready to fight any kind of war anywhere in the world, North Korea has a singular focus, and that is defeating the corrupt puppet regime of the South in glorious combat and killing every Western capitalist pig they find cowering in the corners of Seoul. On the flip side, South Korea has roughly 400,000 active members and 3.1 million in reserve, along with 2,500 tanks, over 260 naval ships, and an air force of about 720 modern aircraft. Those guys are augmented by America's 8th Army, centered around the 2nd Infantry Division, with 20,000 troops in Korea permanently and 50,000 in the general area that would be called onto the peninsula in order to help support combat operations. In a very broad sense, the number of North Koreans vastly outnumber the forces of the South. However, the individual qualities of those forces are significantly lower, and I'm not sure what the current conversion rate is between rock guy and DPRK guy, but I'm sure someone does, and maybe that is you, dear viewer. Obviously, if shit kicked off in the old peninsula, more forces would be brought in to defend the South. However, it would take a significant time to mobilize the military allies, including the United States, to move people and stuff there. The takeaway from that is that both sides are incentivized to do as much killing as fast as possible to gain the upper hand. One thing I think is important when we look at this kind of thing is that when you're doing strategic analysis for military operations is that there are certain assumptions that you never make. You never assume your adversary is a room temperature IQ caricature of a soldier who is 2 days away from starvation and only has 3 rounds for his old rifle that will break after the second one is fired. You always assume they have all the ammo that they would need, are well-trained, at least well-trained enough, and won't retreat the second a bullet flies past their head. The mass defections everyone assumed would happen when the North Koreans were deployed to support Russia never happened. Sure, they watched a lot of porn, but they also actively fought. We can make assumptions based on real facts, like how they lack night vision and don't have much outside of iron sights for their rifles, but we have to assume that they know how to use said iron sights on said rifles. For decades, the very loose plan from the United States and South Korea was just to try to hold as much ground against the North Korean military as possible, and then push them back once the front line stabilized. That changed in 2015, with the introduction of O-Plan 5015, and it was a drastic shift from reacting to an invasion under the previous O-Plan 5027. And no, I don't understand the numbering conventions of these either. Under O-Plan 5027, the older one, ground forces would be tasked with two major objectives: holding key terrain along the border and preventing mechanized forces from breaching the DMZ along the main routes leading into the South's capital. Along the DMZ are hundreds of miles of bunkers, trenches, and prepared fighting positions, with strong pointed defensive posts along high-speed avenues of approach. The ROC and U.S. Army would then conduct what's called a fighting withdrawal, a phrase which here means holding a position until it's no longer tenable, falling back to secondary positions, and then having pre-planned artillery fire cover the retreat. The math on this is pretty straightforward when it comes to attacking and defending. If you are on the offense, you need to retain a 3-to-1 advantage in terms of attackers. Because the North already outnumbers the South by a lot, the goal of the fighting withdrawal would be to inflict as many casualties as possible on the North while placing equal priority on preserving the South's manpower. It was expected that the initial defensive lines would rapidly collapse due to the sheer amount of shit the North would be throwing at them. The final point of forward defenses is the Kansas Line, a highly fortified defensive position anchored on the Imjin and Hantan rivers. Most wargames showed that if the advance were to be stopped there, or at least heavily blunted, the North would not be able to reach Seoul. However, if that line could not be held, the last stand would happen along the Missouri Line, right along the Han River. This would create a major issue for DPRK forces, attempting to advance in impossibly complex urban terrain along with a large water crossing. And if that didn't hold, well, at that point we were kind of fucked, and we need to somehow figure out how to contact the spirit of General MacArthur, peace be upon him. However, that's not typically how it was expected to go. Most estimates place the total North Korean offensive only lasting at most 15 days. The first 5 days would see somewhere between 20 and 50 kilometers of advances along the eastern and western corridors, and the front line stabilizing after 7 to 10 days along either the Kansas or Missouri lines. After that, with combined reinforcements arriving and air supremacy established, the American and ROC counteroffensive would begin. As awesome a movie/video game campaign this would make, it would inflict absolutely bonkers levels of casualties, and I specifically chose bonkers to describe the hundreds of thousands of deaths because I'm trying to keep this video somewhat lighthearted. One of the biggest reasons to shift from a reactive to a proactive plan is that there are roughly 6,000 North Korean artillery guns pointed south, and some estimates place 25 million civilians, roughly half the country, and the capital of Seoul within that firing range. This is sometimes called the tyranny of proximity, which I guess is a nice way of saying that your country's strategic, economic, and cultural hub is about a 20-second flight distance away from a 152mm high-explosive artillery shell. It's not that we thought we couldn't win in a situation where we were reacting to an invasion, but it's a lot easier to retain the South Korean capital than to try to take back whatever's left of it. To add to this, North Korea has a vast network of underground tunnels, bunkers, and command nodes, which would allow them to mass forces for an invasion a lot more subtly than them pretending to do some kind of training exercise on the border or click the "my units are just passing through" option in the leader interaction menu. The modern plan under O-Plan 5015 is essentially a preemptive strike, going on the attack before the war even starts, with the goal of crippling both the North Korean military and their government at once. The strategy would consist of 3 different pillars: precision strikes using long-range artillery, missiles, and aircraft, electronic warfare, and decapitation operations by special forces. Decapitation operations are when you directly target the most important people in an organization in order to disrupt the chain of command at the highest levels. In August of 2015, Korean defense officials got into some hot water because it leaked that part of this plan included schwacking Kim Jong-un himself before the actual fighting even started. Decapitation is a metaphorical phrase, of course, because you're targeting the metaphorical heads of an organization. However, literally cutting off the glorious leader's head would certainly be a striking visual. When the North found out the South was gonna murk their head of state, they cursed it 3 times. Which, if North Korean curses work like saying swipe or no swiping does, if they can manage to curse the South Korean Special Forces 3 times before they pull the trigger, he should be okay. The general idea of O-Plan 5015 is that South Korean infiltrators, using every cool insertion method you can think of like halo jumps and mini submarines, start hunting down DPRK heads of state. Meanwhile, long-range munitions fired from missile batteries or stealth aircraft would eliminate key military targets, namely the massive line of artillery cannons pointed directly at South Korea's capital. While all of that is happening, electronic warfare would cripple the North's ability to coordinate a response. In best-case scenario, this preemptive strike hits so hard, the North tries to negotiate for a ceasefire basically immediately. But if they don't, the disruption caused by O-Plan 5015 would give South Korea enough time to organize their forces and create a strategic buffer zone along the border, keeping their own population centers safe-ish. But what would this look like in practice? Well, we might have already seen a preview of it, and while not officially confirmed, most sources agree that large-scale training exercises like Foal Eagle and Freedom Shield incorporate major parts of the plan without giving too much away. Because this is a preemptive attack plan, not a reactive defensive plan, the trigger for it is absolutely critical. You hit too early, and you basically invaded North Korea for no real reason, other than it just being something to do over the weekend. But if you wait too long, the whole plan kinda goes to shit because you assume that you'd have the jump on the old Norks. Is Norks a slur? I feel like it is. Anyway, O-Plan 5015 could be triggered a few different ways. First would be the obvious. They know that the North is getting ready to attack. This would happen either through strategic intelligence, but also through human resources and signals intelligence. While American Navy SEALs apparently struggle with the task of putting up listening devices over the border, you can best believe the South does not, and I will leave it at that before I get myself and other people in trouble. The second trigger could possibly be when rocket diplomacy starts to be more rocket than it is diplomacy. The North and South love to creatively poke each other from across the border. Anything from blasting K-pop on giant speakers to dropping literal bags of poop via balloons are on the table. It generally doesn't signal escalation, even when it does involve very scary launches of missiles into the Sea of Japan for saber-rattling reasons. If the South feels that the boundary gets crossed, well, it's cowabunga time. South Korea's first priority would be a simultaneous decapitation strike and the destruction of the North's indirect assets, so everything from mortar tubes to nuclear silos are getting blown up. Closer targets will be handled by surface-to-surface strike, while larger, more distant, or more dug-in targets handled by their Air Force. North Korea doesn't have that much that can control the skies necessarily, so it's expected that those strike planes will have pretty much free reign to do whatever they want. The goal of this would be to remove the biggest threat to South Korean civilians and eliminate anything that would possibly degrade the massive defensive fortifications from the south. Any guns not hit by the initial barrage would then be mopped up with counter-battery fire. While the North Korean government starts getting picked off by high-speed dudes with heartbeat sensors, joint American and South Korean troops would push forward into the North blitzkrieg style, in order to seize key military targets and outposts on the other side. While North Korea's posturing right along the border poses a huge threat in terms of an invasion from them, it's also a huge liability on their end. Placing important C2 nodes, supply bases, and communication points so close to the border means that it would not take very long for Southern forces to maneuver and seize them. How far they would go and how many locations would be seized is highly classified for obvious reasons, but the goal would be to put enough space between the max range of North Korean weapons and the civilian population centers in the south. By all accounts, this would not turn into a march on Pyongyang. Unlike that time we took it back in the 50s, old Kim, if he didn't bleed out inside the presidential palace by this point, can launch nukes. The more apparent it is that the goal isn't total takeover of the North, the better the chances are that we don't have to stare at a mushroom cloud on the evening news. Once the international forces reach their objective, they would dig in and wait for reinforcements from outside the peninsula to arrive. At that point, ground forces would continue to hold against any counterattacks, while artillery and aircraft would start hitting targets of opportunity as they arose. Part of O-Plan 5015 puts the majority of the ground fighting responsibility on the South Koreans, which makes sense, it's their country after all, while American ground forces would spearhead decisive or especially defended locations. Meanwhile, the Navy offshore provides missile support and helps keep the skies clear. After that is anyone's guess. In total, most estimates place this state of the fighting to only last 3 or 4 days max. Anything more and it starts to turn into a slogfest in some of the most brutal and unforgiving terrain imaginable. So that's the plan, but obviously planes never survive first contact with the enemy, or if you're a Navy SEAL, first contact with guys trying to catch some fish. By most estimates, North Korea has enough supplies to sustain a couple months' worth of dedicated fighting, and this includes their fuel, ammo, and equipment. However, that could be shrunk pretty rapidly depending on how fast their supply caches start getting targeted. Much of that equipment, however, is near worthless or actively a liability due to how old it is, with third-generation aircraft in their Air Force, APCs from the 50s in their Army, and the need to keep literal T-34 tanks from World War II in operational service. The effectiveness of their quote modern stuff is questionable at best. While they've been showing off things like their new tank, I wouldn't bet any amount of money that those would survive after the first 24 hours, if they even make it to the front. But, and big but there, they still have literally millions of pore sods they can throw into the meat grinder, and quantity has a quality all of its own. Add in the fact that the rough mountainous terrain lends itself to a lot of light infantry fighting, and it stops mattering if they have old shit and we have new shit, because neither shit is getting up some of those mountains. In both the old O plan and the new O plan, casualty estimates ranged from a fuck ton to a metric fuck ton on both sides. Something worth considering is that there are simply too many targets to hit at once. Even if we knew the exact location of every single Nork artillery piece, we simply could not destroy all of them before they start firing. While those artillery tubes are as old as my grandparents, Seoul is such a big target that it doesn't matter if they're inaccurate, if you fire, you're gonna hit something. You might have noticed I have not mentioned drones here. Well, I am now, so calm down. You've probably seen the North Korean pictures of the Globehawk knockoff, a design that's a quarter of a century old at this point, but many sources point towards small drones like we see in Ukraine, also reaching their forces. It also helps that when your biggest trading partner is also the largest drone manufacturer in the world, it starts to not get too hard to put two and two together. Additionally, North Korean forces are reportedly moving away from the mass human wave formations we all love, focusing more on dispersed and flexible small unit ones. It only took them getting slaughtered in Kursk, but they finally figured out what a platoon is. But those experiences in Ukraine and the improved tactics that come with it are worth noting. It doesn't mean that they're now experts in movement and maneuver, but it does mean that they know how to hide from drones, how to survive a precision missile strike, and how to adapt logistics in modern conflicts. All that essentially makes them just harder to kill. It's probably not going to be the difference between who wins and who loses this fight. Even in the worst case training scenarios, the North cannot win this war in the totality. But it does mean the other side is going to have to spend a lot more ammo and lives to make that win happen. Now, out of moral obligation, so that this is not a fear and or warmongering channel, this war is a very unlikely scenario. The first, second, and third priorities of Kim's regime is to just stay in power and literally not die. Starting any kind of war would be both metaphorically and literally suicidal. Sorry, this is social media. I meant self-unaliving. Their military is more useful as a tool for international coercion and keeping their own population in line than it is dying along the DMZ. The North Koreans being sent to Kursk was more about opening up their country economically and diplomatically, and the combat experience they gained being more of a convenient byproduct. China very much does not benefit from a potentially nuclear exchange on its southern border, or the loss of a buffer state between it and a military adversary. North Korea literally torpedoed a South Korean corvette back in 2010, and they still didn't go to war over it. South Korea's status as a technological powerhouse only happened within the last few decades, and they are in no rush to put that at risk while also seeing their capital burn. Personally, I do not think this war will ever happen, which is good, because both of the Homefront video games sucked, and I don't need to relive that. But on that note, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Please subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.